Ole Gunnar Solskjaer then, Samuel, let's discuss that, because he made his return to Old Trafford, didn't he? First time since he was dismissed as manager in late 2021. But we'll discuss his comments about the Glazers as well. Been neglecting the club, it's time for a takeover, it's time for change. I guess when you looked at his comments when he was manager, he said Joe Glazer loved the club. He said the Glazers were committed to the club. So where do you stand on this, Samuel? Because I've saw some people praising Solskjaer for coming out and saying it, but it also feels like he perhaps should have done a little bit more when he was manager, but then you could argue, look, his hands were tied. What's your verdict?
It was classic volte-face stuff, really, from a man who posed for a selfie with Avram Glazer and one of the Glazer relatives who is not Joel Glazer, despite what picture desks continue to try and suggest otherwise. It's happened with others. I mean, Gary Neville was a Glazer apologist up until 2 years ago when the Super League came about and Salford City's place in the Football League was threatened by it. And now Gary Neville is the loudest on of the Glazer out movement, really, it feels like, bar the supporters who go to games. Yet it would have been more impactful if he'd actually said something about them when he was a Man United player. And even when he retired, it wasn't for another 10 years that he decided to unload on the Glazers. And that was probably because of the fact that he's the Salford City co-owner. With Solskjaer, I mean, there were a lot of interesting comments that he made, and you know, he's not wrong when he says Old Trafford has been neglected, Carrington has been neglected, but he'd have got a lot more respect if he'd actually said some of these things in a tactful way when he was manager. The problem is, and Ty and I know from press conferences and the dreaded Zoom call era as well, he was an extremely clunky communicator, and you cannot underestimate that when you're the Man United manager. You've got to be able to communicate. And it descended into farce in his last weeks when he said verbatim that Marcus Rashford needs to focus more on football. It was words, pretty much almost to that effect. We all reported what he said, and then at the start of his next pretty much press conference, in between they'd got hammered 4-2 at Leicester as well. At the start of his next press conference, he decided to turn on the journalists who were there virtually for apparently spinning it, but that was old order United as well. They didn't communicate as well as they did back then, despite the best attempts of certain personnel at the club, but they didn't have the right manager to do it. I mean, the comment about snowflakes in the dressing room, again, he's not wrong about that. I think everyone on this podcast is exempt from it, but there are snowflakes. There are the millennial mentality. It exists in every workplace. We've seen it in the newsroom. This air of entitlement and the feeling, the entitlement that you don't have to actually work hard to get something. I mean, you're about 12, aren't you still, Stephen? And you work as hard as anyone to get your opportunities, and you absolutely, I say it completely objectively, you have the right work ethic, you have the right attitude, but there are some in workplaces who don't, and we all know what that dressing room was like at United, and how the players were indulged, and how really they did ride roughshod over the manager, and they took liberties because they had a substitute teacher in charge. And that's the problem that seemed to be lost on Solskjaer. Yes, it's different to how it was under Roy Keane, and yeah, they wouldn't have survived in the Roy Keane era because times have changed. But if you're a really good manager, you change with the times. He didn't, and also he actually cultivated that culture of the player power era. I mean, he was the manager at the time when United were trying to offer or get Jesse Lingard and Paul Pogba to sign new contracts. Why? He was the manager when Eric Bailly was given a new contract. Again, why? If you're overseeing something like that, you're not going to have great control of the dressing room, and also you're not cultivating the right dressing room. United do not miss any of those three players, and it's a pity for United that Bailly is still contracted at the club, and true to form, he's not going to play enough games for Marseille this season for to trigger their obligation to sign him permanently. So, look, and also, although Solskjaer may grumble over certain individuals in that dressing room, he did mismanage a hell of a lot of them as well. I mean, I can't remember how long ago it was, but we were going through the players he mismanaged, and we'd named 3 of them, and that was just from the goalkeeping department alone. De Gea got sick and tired of the rotation with Henderson. Henderson obviously made it very plain and clear last year that he was unhappy, to put it mildly, that he wasn't made number 1 after Solskjaer said he was going to make him number 1. Tom Heaton rejoined United on the assumption that he was going to be the number 2. He was the number 3. So that's just 3 from the goalkeeping department alone. And there are other players as well who've publicised their misgivings or their unhappiness, and there are others who've been more private about it. But sometimes you've got to look at yourself, and he's not had a job for 18 months now. Even though he did, by and large, reasonably well at United, I'd say he overachieved in that nobody expected him to be there that long. Nobody would have thought Solskjaer would oversee a second place finish, misleading though it was, and pretty meaningless as well, given the training ground atmosphere that games were played out in that season. But he's so associated with United that nobody will touch him with a barge pole, and his greatest feat remains winning the Norwegian League with Molde. And I thought when he left United that, well, Norway national team job, that should be lined up for him. We mentioned that to one of our old Norwegian friends, Arilas, who was at United games very regularly during Solskjaer's first full season, and he told us that Ståle Solbakken is regarded as the better coach in Norway. And Ståle Solbakken was he Wolves manager when they got relegated to League One about 10 or 11 years ago. So, I mean, it almost feels like it's something from the Twilight Zone that Solskjaer ever managed United. And not only did he manage them, he got a new contract, and he was seen by some at the club as being the man to make them a force again. It was good to see that he got a good reception, but he was always going to get a good reception on Saturday because of his playing legacy. He is a legend, and he scored the most replayed and the most famous goal in the club's history, and he endeared himself to United supporters long before that goal at Camp Nou as well. And they'll always cherish those memories. But as a manager, although he had some points when he went to that event on Friday evening, it's easier to say it now, and there were certain things he could have said at the time when he was manager, but he decided against saying them.
It's very well summarised, but I will say, on Samuel's point about me looking 12 years old, I can grow better facial hair than Samuel, so I can't sleep well at night. I can't sleep well at night.
I do not.
Touché.
I know my stubble is it's sometimes you don't want to shave too often. That's what I find anyway. But I am definitely better clean shaven.
Yeah, I mean, Ty's sitting there with his beard. But that's enough for the facial hair chat. We'll be back in a moment for part 3.